Thanks so much, Josie. Good morning, everyone. My name's Purry Dillon, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm the one who was doing that ridiculous blankety blank wave when Josie introduced me. I can't help myself, even on Zoom, I'm still doing the big wave. I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm the director of the Social Justice Collective, and we're a consultancy that supports people across our sector to maximise their social impact. Last year, myself and my colleague Shaka Bachman worked with the Charity Governance Code Steering Group and a range of experts from across the charity sector to create the new Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Principle. And today, I'm really delighted that I'm joined by colleagues from Little Village, Alan and Sophie, and we've been working together actually over the last 6 months as they've embarked on their own journey of applying the EDI principle to their charity. And despite feeling like I know them really well, I realise we actually haven't ever met in person. Such are the strange times that we're working in. Alan and Sophie, would you like to introduce yourselves? I'll go to Sophie first.
Thanks, Purry. Hello, I'm Sophie Livingston. I'm the Chief Exec of Little Village. I joined as Chief Exec back in February, back in that horrible lockdown earlier this year. So I'm quite new in role, but I've actually been involved with Little Village since 2018 as a trustee and as the chair of the board, actually. And when our founder, Sophia, decided she wanted to step down, I was really compelled to apply for her job at Little Village. And so I stepped away from the board to do that. And very briefly, Little Village is a baby bank, so a bit like a food bank, but for baby kitten clothing for children under 5. We run a number of hubs across London. We also work very closely with the families that we support on signposting them onto other services. And we're just beginning our work as a force for change to work alongside our families to highlight the root causes that have led them to need our support and help, and so to tackle child poverty. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this today, Purry.
And over to you, Alan. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Purry. Thanks, Sophie. Hi, yes, I'm Alan. I've been a trustee at Village for about 5 months, I think. In terms of my day job, I'm in my 8th day at ICIVO as the new head of influencing. For those who hate acronyms like me, that's the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. And it's great to be here. My background generally is centred around political influencing for charities and NGOs of all sizes and issues, as well as students working in Parliament and civil service. And it's great to be here with you all.
Thank you both. So we're here today on the nearly anniversary of the EDI principle, and we just wanted to kick off with a quick poll, which I'm hoping is going to pop up in front of you now. And I'm just going to leave that open whilst I carry on talking. So are you currently implementing the Charity Governance Code EDI principle, yes or no? Okay, so we're here to be talking through 7 key things that I'm hoping will help you to apply this principle in your organisation with both confidence and clarity. And Alan and Sophie are here to give you the lowdown on their experience of applying the principle in real life. I already know that they're going to be the stars of the show. So the first key learning is that it's a journey. And if we could just pop across to the next slide, that would be great. Oh, and the next one again. Lovely. So in our experience, there's no shortage of enthusiasm for doing EDI work in our sector. And in fact, we found that most people are really eager to get going on creating more equitable organisations and outcomes. But actually, there is a real risk of rushing to fix a problem. And the challenge here, the results are in. The challenge here is that with rushing to take action on EDI, it may well lead to taking actions that are tokenistic or can cause more damage. For example, there's a real risk in the rush to recruit trustees with lived experience into cultures that are not set up to include them yet, or into boards that haven't worked out why they need that diversity. So actually rushing to fix the problem in this way could lead to tokenism or cause more damage. Moving on to number 2. So instead of rushing to take action, we found that the better place to start is with number 2 on our list, which is to ask ourselves why. Why is EDI important for our charity? And it's really key at this stage to make time and space to talk actually as a whole board about what equality, diversity, and inclusion means for your charity and for your board. At this stage, assessing why it's important within your context is really, really key. In our experience, being context specific is hugely important. So for example, for a medical research charity, EDI might be really important because the inequalities in society are reflected in the boardroom and then are reflected in decisions on health inequalities. So for this board, it might be a really key focus to put their energy into imbalances in power and perspective by involving those who've experienced health inequality in their decision making and in their data and research. But for a really small Lincolnshire village hall, it might be quite different. So EDI might be important for them because their service provision is not reaching working class people in the village. So they may focus their energy on creating space on the board for working class voices to shape an organisation that's more reflective and relevant to that community. Sophie, I wanted to invite you to share your early conversations with your chair, Olivia, about why EDI is important for Little Village.
Okay, thank you. So Little Village was founded by a group of mums in Tooting in 2016, and they wanted to do something good with the overwhelming amount of baby stuff that you accumulate when you have children, and give that to families who didn't have the money to buy all that volume of stuff. And that's how Little Village grew. It grew an amazing community around it of really dedicated volunteers and eventually staff, and we got some lottery funding to get us going. Families that we supported were coming into our hubs prior to COVID, and that meant relationships were built with them. And before COVID hit us, about 10% of our volunteers at Little Village had previously received gifts from Little Village. We talk about giving a gift to our families, gifting them rather than a handout. We'd also done some work with On-Road Media with a group of women who became ambassadors for us, and we've worked with them and with other parents we've supported who've then appeared on Channel 4 News, BBC News, etc., to share their experiences in a way that doesn't exploit them and their experiences. But we still didn't feel that that was enough, and we felt that we needed to do more to ensure that the lived experience of families raising children in poverty was really reflected in the makeup of our staff and our volunteers and at the heart of our work. We actually started, because we were founded by mums, as a term time only operation, which obviously tackled one form of inclusion, but it ended up excluding others who couldn't afford to work only term time, for the wages, only being paid during term time. So it actually ended up with not a broad staff diversity. And we also knew that that lived experience wasn't reflected on our board, which had grown from that initial volunteer pool of parents. So we've been working and talking about how to address this across the organisation, and felt that it was really important to ensure that the board was absolutely at the heart of this, rather than, as so often happens, the two get treated in total isolation. So we started from a whole organisation approach, but actually coming at it from starting with the board first.
Thank you, Sophie. It's nice to reflect on those early conversations as well, and where it's got to now. So after asking yourselves why, we're going to move on to step number 3. It's really important to ask yourselves why we don't have that now. So who is or is not on our board, and why not? Why have we not considered data on minoritized communities in our decision making in the past? Assessing your current understanding, practice, and culture around EDI allows your board to be really clear on its starting point. And I just want to share 6 practical ways of doing this. It's not an exclusive list at all, but these are some key things that we've found really worked. So one of those is adding diversity or lived experience audits to your annual skills audit questionnaires. Another is carrying out role reviews to ensure that your requirements are not limiting who's able to be a trustee. It could also be holding exit interviews to understand why previous trustees may not have felt included, may not have had their voices heard. It might be carrying out 360 reviews on those who make decisions or those who chair board discussions to assess how they enable a diversity of perspectives to be explored. For service charities, it might be checking whether your board reflects the people you exist for or the diversity of that community. And for all charities, it's important to start discussing critically and honestly whether your meetings are spaces in which everyone has power to participate and shape decisions. Sophie, I'm going to come back to you again and ask if you could share a little bit about the work that you and Helen did to review the board and the board culture.
Thank you. So Helen's one of our trustees, and actually she did this during my weird hiatus when I wasn't on the board and wasn't chief exec, when I was going through the awkward application for this job process. But she led a piece of work looking at our governance overall, which involved speaking to trustees as well as staff about how the board worked and how effective it was. One of the key conclusions, which wasn't surprising, was that too many trustees were too similar, white, middle-class, middle-aged women with corporate backgrounds, and that we really needed to prioritise changing the composition of the board to bring in people with different backgrounds and life and work experiences. And it also identified issues with the way we work together and the opportunity to build a much stronger and more cohesive board culture. And then it also highlighted the need to improve trustees' engagement with and understanding of the rest of the organisation. So we then, at the end of that review, decided that we needed to do a number of things: recruit new trustees to the board with different backgrounds and life and career experiences, design a much better comprehensive trustee induction programme, undertake work around board culture, which is what we have done with Puri, but linked with new trustees coming on board, and setting up much clearer expectations of trustees, so having a clear contract in terms of their commitment and behaviours that are expected, annual objective setting and review sessions with the chair, having an annual board effectiveness review, and then really deepening trustees' understanding of engagement with the organisation. For example, expecting a regular volunteering commitment. Trustees are copied into the weekly update that I send to all the staff, and we have a trustee being a point person for particular areas of responsibility in the organisation. So the most important conclusion of that whole process really was, who is the board and how do we work together as a board and with the organisation?
Thanks, Sophie. So after you've done some assessment and have a greater understanding across your board, you will be ready for step number 4, which is to set yourself some really context-specific goals. And at this point, it's actually unhelpful to have all of this cracked in one step, or even to have a plan to have it all cracked in one step. It's much better to focus on what's important to your charity, as we talked about in point number 2, and then to define from that current starting point, what are your time-bound and realistic goals, and what can be achieved to get you towards what's important for you as a charity. Now, for some, that's going to mean working hard to create inclusive cultures and behaviours, and Sophie's just talked about that a little bit. That might also include deciding what it does not look like and what to do when you see those exclusive behaviours. It might mean for others that the whole board might commit to some learning together to decide what is an inclusive culture and define and create that between them. And for some, it might mean that once that inclusive culture is agreed and starting to be implemented, there's a need to make space for new members. So this term making space, for me, it means quite a lot of things. Making space means, on a really simple level, not just opening up one position on the board for a diverse trustee to join and be given responsibility for EDI in its totality, because of course that risks tokenism. Instead, it's making space on your board for more than one trustee, and I would say ideally 3, to join at around the same time so that a tipping point can be created for culture change. Making space can also mean creating time on your agendas for the whole board to engage in discussions and decisions relating to EDI, rather than leaving it as a conversation that just a few are having, or that perhaps one person is responsible for. It's also about creating space in all board role descriptions for that EDI responsibility, so everybody understands why they're responsible for it and the fact that it sits in each of those roles. For some organisations, it might even mean working with the executive of the charity to define a new direction or strategies that will create more equality of outcomes in line with the charity's purpose. One little side note that I wanted to make at this point was around the recruitment of trustees with lived experience. I'd strongly advise that boards avoid recruiting just through their own networks. And on the next slide, I've just flagged a couple of key things that I think would be really useful to read. Reach have just published a brilliant research report called Trustee Diversity, Who's Applying and Who's Appointed. And it sets out the many reasons why it's problematic to continue the current trend of appointing trustees through word of mouth, including the enormous impact that this is having on age and ethnic diversity on boards. The findings of that report really underline the importance of open recruitment, and they point to the many resources that are available out there to support you in running open, inclusive recruitment processes. You can also find some really great recruitment advice, but also some broader thoughts on inclusivity across organisations, particularly relating to race, in Akivo's Home Truths report. And Alan might talk a little bit later on about version 2 of that report coming up relatively soon. Alan, you've been on the board for Little Village for 4 or 5 months now, as you said. In that time, the board has invested a lot of time in collectively assessing its EDI journey, as we were just talking about, and also setting some really context-specific EDI goals for its culture, its representation, and its strategy and purpose. Could you talk us through how that process has been, and also how it's felt for you as a trustee joining a board?
Yes, thank you. I mean, my thoughts here will inevitably be a bit top line. We've had some lengthy sessions, so I can't go into the full detail, but I think I'll open it up by saying, look, as we know, one of the most important signifiers of change is creating the space for it, something that Pari's already talked about. And I feel like that's been done in the short time I've been here. In terms of more detail, we've had 2 sessions, both facilitated by you, Pari, which have been excellent. And the first was actually at my first board meeting, which for me signified the intent and commitment around EDI. In terms of process, we started by defining what board excellence and leading EDI or anti-oppression at Little Village could look like. And we covered both what the good and the bad was in that respect. We discussed the importance of leading by example, of ongoing learning, and also about centering community voices and lived experience. What was also quite clear was by the time we got to the second session, a few months later, we had become more ambitious. And I think the scale of ambition included embedding EDI through all of Little Village's works and culture. So it's not just something that sits in a silo. How does EDI impact our fundraising or our communications and everything else in between? We also talked about being unapologetic and asking questions and challenging as well. And then finally, we discussed in the last session about having an actionable and measurable strategy. And that just keeps up the momentum and is something that we hold ourselves accountable to. But I think with that, if you don't mind, I kind of want to just talk a bit about how it started for me entering at Little Village, and that was around recruitment. Look, I'll say at this stage in my career, it's important that places I'm involved in have credibility on the issues I care about. So for Little Village, that was around child poverty and also their approach to EDI. And there were 2 of the reasons why I wanted to join Little Village. EDI in particular is at this stage of my career and life is of central importance to me. So I feel like that needs to be a core part of any organization I'm involved in, paid or voluntary. And if it isn't, I won't be, and it's that simple, I guess. So in that, I think it's always right to embarrass your fellow panelists, but my journey started before that. So Sophie and Pari in particular, I remember a few years ago as a trustee, a relatively new trustee, sitting at I think it was an NCVO conference, and I remember seeing Sophie on stage and talking quite openly and challenging around EDI. And if I'm honest, it was one of the most impressive things I had heard around it, and particularly from someone who was a non-person of colour, and I really appreciated it. And sitting there at the back of the room, I was kind of looking around, but I was like, I felt seen, and so I kind of always knew of Sophie, and obviously Pari, which in my view is one of the oracles of like EDI work, although she's quick to say there are no experts, and she is right, but that didn't help me when I turned up for an interview at Little Village, and there she was in front of me. So let's say nerves went up the roof. But I just want to set the context of when I said about who I'm joining and who's involved and the commitment there. And Sophie and Pari were both part of that reason. And just to bring that to life a bit, I think there's also a little bit about rhetoric versus reality, what people talk about and what they hear. Now, just very quickly, I'm a first generation immigrant. I didn't speak English. I live in Whitechapel, experienced child poverty. So a lot of the issues I work on are issues that I've lived and I care about because of that. Now, I had this great chat with Sophie before I decided to apply, and lived experience came through a lot, and as well as the EDI approach. And I set to apply. Now, my mother, speaking openly, she lives by herself near me in Whitechapel. We're carers for her. She has a few medical conditions. She got long COVID. So what happened is I couldn't apply and I missed the deadline. And that was it. The end of that. I felt like, as someone who respects the process, I was like, I couldn't go and ask for more time. But, Sophie got in touch and just kind of encouraged me if I still wanted to say, look, the deadline's gone, but if you're still interested, we'd be happy to receive an application. And I genuinely wanted to, but for me, again, that goes to the EDI for me became a reality. It wasn't just rhetoric and nice words on the page. And Sophie following up was really made me more excited to want to join, and I applied. In terms of the application, I felt it embraced diversity in its fullest. I've never seen an option to record the video as one of your answers, as well as write. Now, I'm not cool enough to be recording any video, so I went down the traditional route and just wrote something. But again, I like that diversity and give range to people's backgrounds, experiences, and skills. The panel itself was diverse, but also very relaxed. They asked me a lot of open questions rather than the usual competency-based ones you get asked. So questions like, what would make you feel safe and included? What would you need to thrive? So yeah, so just a bit of context there about kind of my entry into Little Village and some of the stuff we've done. Over to you, Para.
Alan, such helpful insights and also such generosity in the things you always say. So thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So once goals have been set, the stage is set for taking action. But it's at this stage really important to remember that it's about progress, not perfection. So whilst the stage is set for taking action, it's also set for reviewing it and learning from it on a loop. It's really important at this stage to be willing to make mistakes and to learn from them. So many of you will probably have heard me say this by now, but EDI is not like changing the fuse in a plug. You don't learn how to do it once and then just do it on repeat. In reality, it's a process of self-assessment, learning, taking action, being willing to learn from successes, but also from failures along the way. For me, it's iterative, it's constantly evolving, just as society evolves. And actually, I see that as a really liberating way of looking at this work because it allows us to keep on trying and learning, even if, or maybe I should say, especially when, mistakes are made along the way. Alan or Sophie, I'm going to come to either one of you now. Would you be up for sharing any mistakes or any subsequent learning that the Little Village Board have made along the way, or anything that you feel hasn't gone right yet?
Shall I start? So I think we're still very much a board of professionals, and I've really been reflecting on a comment made by a trustee about a month ago about the amount of papers we produce for board meetings and how that would be challenging for neurodiverse trustees or for trustees with less experience of meeting culture. I've just been really reflecting on how we shouldn't just be expecting people to slot into an existing way of working. And while we've definitely improved it this year, there's clearly more to do, especially if we want to continue our journey to bring in more trustees with different experiences and backgrounds.
And Alan? Yeah, I mean, I'd probably just endorse Sophie's kind of point. I think, most boards are kind of full of professionals, and I guess speaking from my own personal experience, historically there's not often space given in organizations with lived experience of issues and talking them through in the way that is helpful for policy change. And I think that's because historically organizations have given primacy to technical or occupational knowledge over lived experience. And I really like the fact that, Sophie and Little Village wants to change the narrative around this and prioritize lived and community experience. And I think in doing that and in getting people from more diverse backgrounds into the board, we'll be able to think differently as trustees and most importantly, because that will be closer to the experiences of many of the people we work with. So it's also a kind of organizational reputational risk if we don't do that. So yeah.
Thank you both for sharing that. I think there's something really powerful in us being willing to share our mistakes and challenges as well as our successes as we go through these journeys. So I'm going to move us on to slide number 6. Once you've started to take some actions toward your own specific context-specific goals, it's also really important to begin to publish your performance against those goals. Ideally, together we will create a sector in which people are sharing their progress, their performance, and what they've learned from their challenges and mistakes. And just in the way that goals should be contextualized, as we spoke about earlier, one of the key recommendations that I would make is that performance monitoring will also be most powerful if it is contextualized. So, for example, reporting on the racial or gender balances of a board might be an excellent measure of diversity, but it could also mask that actual power imbalances still persist in boardrooms, where the power positions or decision-making processes still remain really exclusive. So reporting on diversity should be coupled with reporting on inclusion and ultimately on the equality of outcomes being achieved. But for all boards, there's the immediate opportunity to report on its performance against the goals that it's set within its context and in relation to its current reality. This will mean more meaningful change for many charity boards who are at different stages of their journey. Sophie and Alan, having asked you to share a challenge on the journey, I'd love to ask you to share a success or something that you're really happy to report has been achieved as a result of this work already.
I think the work we've done on recruitment and the subsequent workshops that we've done with Purry have really shifted our emphasis as an organisation. It feels like everyone on the board is now committed to this journey, and that we really need to make sure that families living in poverty or experiencing poverty need to be at the heart of this organisation. And we know that our work will never be done, as we can always keep improving, but we've got a shared approach now, and we can discuss how we move forward in a safe way together. And as the CEO, I feel really supported. Not always the case with CEOs and boards. So it's a lovely position to be in. And I'm really excited about how we can now start to focus on how we move our focus to the rest of the organisation, which is something we'll be starting in the new year.
Yeah, I mean, I've just add to that. I mean, I kind of perhaps gave an example of successful recruitment and my own experience. So for me, that was a real sign of success and that genuine commitment. But I think also in the way we've done these sessions and the journey so far, I think there's been an openness and an honesty that has allowed everyone to come to the table in their own different experiences of diversity and inclusion. And I think that we also recognize that mistakes will be made on a journey. And I think that's important to acknowledge, because I think we're more likely to perhaps be ambitious and not scared to kind of mess it up occasionally. And I think in tapping into that mindset, we're also able to build trust and safety in a way that enables us all. And that includes people who are new to EDI and allows them to have full ownership in that. So I think that the integrity and including everyone, it's not just one or two people, as was already mentioned. I get the sense that like everyone is part of this, and I've certainly had conversations around this at different organizations, different boards. That's not the case, so I'm very excited about that.
Thank you both. I think we've all used the word journey multiple times, and it definitely brings me on to the final slide that we wanted to share, was that it is an ongoing journey. It really is. As your context changes, as society changes, as you continue to learn, as resources increase or inevitably also decrease, EDI becomes ever more important to ensure that boards are relevant to the shifting challenges that our sector's facing. We faced so many over the last year. And actually in these times, it's so much more important that decisions are not made for the communities that we exist for. In fact, they're made with them, and that our resources are reaching those who need them the most. It is an ongoing journey to also keep on building and maintaining a board that is diverse and inclusive and delivers equality through the charity's purpose and mission. I hope today has been a step forward in that journey for all of you today. From me, my final thought is to keep your focus on why EDI is important to your charity and to be really context specific in your planning, actions and reporting. Sophie and Alan, any final thoughts from either of you?
I feel bad, I keep jumping in ahead of you, Alan, sorry. But I think I've learned so much from this process, and I think we might be giving the impression that it's all been sort of sweetness and light the whole way through. Actually, we weren't in a brilliant place probably this time last year as a board, and I think it's incredible to see how that's flipped. I've learned so much from this process. It has been hard. We've all had to put ourselves into quite a vulnerable place to create that change, and invest a lot emotionally, I think, as well as a collective. But you get the benefits when you put yourself out there. It's been brilliant to have Perry as our guide. I don't think we'd be where we are today without her. I think thinking about who can help you work through a process as a sort of neutral party has, in my experience, been really transformative. And this process has shifted my entire frame on Little Village. I think we're in a much better position to take decisions about our future that ensure the community that Little Village exists for is at our heart of everything we do. And ultimately, they will be there themselves at the centre with the voice and the power.
Yeah, 100% to all of that. And yeah, I think yeah, it's an ongoing process. And I think prioritizing depth and not just speed, I think, is key in ensuring best outcomes in this area. And yeah, I think taking the time and the space as we've done would be important for lots of organizations to progress in this area. And the fact that some of our thinking had already progressed and moved on by the second session, I guess shows me the importance of checking in, not just doing it and putting it on the website and saying, well, let's review this in 5 years. Things change very quickly, right? Communications and the way we talk to each other and our stories and what's appropriate, not so. So I think we need to see it in the same way we do with other organizational priorities. So yeah.
Thank you so much. So we have come to the end of our formal bit, not so formal bit, and we are going to close with a quick poll, and then actually we have some time for questions. I know some questions have been popping up in the chat as we've gone, but please do feel free to add some more in there. So the poll should be in front of you, and I'll just read it out. So what will help you to take your first or your next step on your EDI journey? And it's a multiple choice one here. A recording of this webinar, hopefully it's helpful. A copy of the slides, a chat with an EDI guide, a chat with the board further on the journey, Akivo's Home Truths report, Reach's Trustee Diversity report, and NCVO's Know-How resources. So I shall just leave that open, and then I'll hand back to Josie.
Thank you, guys. I have to say, listening to it again, it just reinforces what a kind of rich and insightful presentation you've all given. So thank you very much for that. So if we can move on to the next slide. Before we head into questions, I just wanted to, I know Perry mentioned about NCVO Know-How resources. So on that note, I just wanted to mention a few quick things in case you weren't aware. So actually, as it's Trustees Week, we've actually kind of let down our member paywall for all of our governance know-how resources. So do feel free during the week to go and access those. We've also, if you've really enjoyed what you've heard today and want more, we've also launched a new training on equality, diversity and inclusion in charity governance. And you can find out more about this on NCVO's training platform. And this is actually going to be led by Perry. So yes, definitely if you've liked this and you want more, do have a look at that. We do have 2 more events happening during this week to celebrate Trustees Week. So if you haven't already had a look at what else we've got on, we've got something tomorrow on sort of mental health and well-being and leading by example. and then we've got a panel discussion on Friday. A couple of people have asked about slides and recordings. We definitely will be sending both of those out in our follow-up email. So I know that quite a few questions have been coming in. So I think I've pulled out a few that hopefully capture some of the comments. So if I can start with you, Parry, with a question about sort of what is the single most powerful thing we can do to make progress on EDI?
I love that question. It's also a massive question. And I'm going to caveat my answer with the fact that if you ask me that in a month's time, I might say something different, partly to flag the fact that I think EDI is iterative for us all, including me. And as Alan said, I don't see myself as an EDI expert, just someone facilitating and still learning. So yeah, I think it's important to be open that we're all on a learning journey. But for me, I think the single most important thing is growing a shared understanding across your trustee board and your exec of why this work on EDI is so crucial to our sector. So our sectors, in my view, our sector's key purpose is social change. But we need to understand that even though our purpose is to create social good, we exist within deeply rooted, centuries-old power systems in which some groups of people are systemically advantaged, whilst others are systemically disadvantaged or oppressed. So our work and our actions on EDI must also be systemic, which for me is another reason that we have to treat this work as an ongoing journey. So I think the single most powerful thing for me is boards and execs committing to seeking to understand how systemic disadvantage manifests in society, in our sector, in our own individual charities, in who makes decisions, in what we deliver. And then from that place of understanding, to take action to change that system whilst constantly learning along the way. That would be my response. Ask me again in a month.
Great answer. Thank you for that. Maybe that segues then quite nicely onto just that bit about kind of systemic change and sort of, you know, a kind of the need for a kind of whole board commitment to this kind of process. I think it was kind of quite clear in your presentations about the fact that commitment and time is required for a kind of well thought through EDI journey. And so I guess a question for Sophie and Alan as well. So for organizations that are kind of struggling to get that commitment from their board, can you give any top tips on sort of how to get buy-in from your board and how to get them to commit the time and the resource?
Alan, you go first this time.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I can only speak as a kind of a trustee. I think it depends. Like I'm just from my own experience on a previous board where it was pretty much just me. Like I guess people have had a different. Well, as a person of color, it was people from very professional backgrounds. I think what I found helpful was the chair was very committed to this. And they allowed me the space to really talk about it, which was tiring, and particularly when a lot of people were just kind of like nodding along or kind of, you know, quite openly upset about some of my thoughts around this. This is a long time ago, but I think having that chair and having external events that were changing in the world actually was useful in committing people. So I think we started by just having open conversations, bringing people in, normalizing difficult, uncomfortable conversations. I've always spoken quite openly. Once you get through that lived experience and it's live, those words, most people who are decent can stop the theorizing and just look at that person and be like, right, okay, maybe we should just listen. And then kind of things we've already covered, like depending on the board makeup, I think just creating space and being willing to challenge yourself and be uncomfortable, knowing that there will be mistakes and it's a journey, you know, stick with it, I would say. but I guess Sophie probably will have a much more refined answer than I would. But yeah, they would be my thoughts off the top of my head.
I think yeah, I think with the best will in the world, not everyone is going to buy into this. I think there's tackling people one-on-one and having conversations where people can express their thoughts and feelings in a safe way, and their anxiety about it, I think, is really important. And highlighting that, you know, the best thing to do is to start this. Mistakes will be made, but we can learn from them. And as Parry has said, bringing it back to the organisation's purpose. Why is this important for our organisation and fulfilling our mission, which I think then depersonalises it. But having said that, I think there's also a responsibility on those of us with privilege to be allies in this space and to take on the burden of this work. So that the speech that Alan was referring to, which was at the NCVO Trustee Week conference back in 2019, back when we could gather, was one of the things I said was, you know, people have got a responsibility to both step up to the plate on this and also step back and share power and create a much broader, you know, opening their arms to people with different experiences. And that may make people feel vulnerable and uncomfortable, but frankly, it has to happen, sounding brutal about it. But, you know, it's incumbent on us, if we link it back to our organisation's purpose and civil society's purpose, as Parry has said, can we afford not to be doing this work?
Thank you. Actually, on that sort of issue around power and privilege, because I think that can bring up a lot of vulnerabilities. We have a question about, you know, where you have a situation where your board may not be willing to kind of understand their own power and privilege. And just, I guess maybe Parry, you can kick us off with this, but, you know, what do you have any kind of top tips in terms of like the best way to kind of start to have those conversations about power and privilege and to kind of create that space for people to feel a bit vulnerable?
Thanks, Josie. Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think it's one of the barriers for people getting involved in this work is their fear of what's going to happen to me and will I feel unsafe or uncomfortable in this. And one of the key things that we certainly do, and we spent quite a lot of time with Little Village doing, was talking about, well, how do we even have these conversations? Because actually we don't want to make anyone feel unsafe, but discomfort is part of this, because we're talking about creating change. And change, no matter what it is tends to be uncomfortable, particularly here where we're talking about power systems and power dynamics, which, as I said before, systemically advantage some and disadvantage others, can feel really uncomfortable to step into those conversations. So we tend to work with boards to deeply invest some time to say, how do we have safe, uncertain conversations or create brave spaces for these difficult conversations? There's a beautiful poem which I will dig out and share with you to send to delegates afterwards, which talks about the creation of brave spaces. But I think that for me is the really key starting point, and it works well for equity, diversity, inclusion and anti-oppression conversation and for the learning to happen. But actually, I think it also works well for boards just to function really well. It begins to say, well, what does an inclusive culture look like? If I feel unsafe to talk about something like equality, diversity and inclusion, that's probably also manifesting in my power on this board generally. How do I speak up or silence myself or take space or make space for others? How do I know when to do that in all of our conversations as a board? So actually in even setting up the conversations for power and privilege, I think we're creating something that is very helpful for all board discussions. On power and privilege itself, they've become, or certainly the word privilege has become quite a sensitive word in this space. And I've been really struck by Dr. Muna Abdi's delivered some really interesting thinking actually around this, about actually, is it better to talk about systemic disadvantage and advantage, rather than privilege, because immediately people are sort of switching off to hearing about it. One of the key things we also do is to talk about the fact that privilege doesn't mean you've had an easy life. It doesn't mean everything's been swimmingly good for you and you've had everything handed to you on a golden plate. It's talking about the fact that this is a system that we need to understand, and within that system we all have a place that we either benefit from that system or are oppressed by that system, and often in different ways, in different parts of our identity, and they can layer together. And we go into this in loads more detail in the training course that you just mentioned, Josie. But I think it is important to take it step by step when you're going through these theories and concepts. And so we tend not to run a whole day session because this stuff is emotional. It takes vulnerability to have these conversations openly and meaningfully. But it also takes time between learning it to begin to think, how do I really apply this? So we often have people in session 1, you can see them sort of being, they're like, I'm not sure. And then they come back in session 2 and something has happened where they've seen how this applies to their daily lives. And I can't tell you the amount of times in our sessions that people say, now that I see it, I can't unsee it, and I see it everywhere. And I can't now not take action on it. It brings that urgency out, I think, when you can really understand how power and privilege manifests in the world.
Great, thank you. I'm just thinking, Alan, Sophie, do you want to add to anything there in terms of your own experience around having those conversations?
Yeah, I would just very quickly, I thought the concept of discomfort is interesting as well, because I always like to ask whose discomfort is at stake here, and quite often within a status quo, it's the usual suspects, and that's at the expense of the others who are kind of used to experience that discomfort. So I remember having a conversation a couple of years ago around diversity at an organization I was at, and I kind of was just talking about it, and there was I was the only person of color in that organization, in that kind of senior management position, and a colleague turned on and said, well, you know, diversity isn't just about race. And I thought, wow, like, but I was ashamed because I remember, like, I felt uncomfortable and I apologized. I said, oh yeah, no, I know that. And actually I talk about class a lot, which is true. But you see what I was doing? Though I was uncomfortable, I was apologizing, and I feel ashamed that I did that now. And what was it about what I was saying that non-targeted approach that was making them feel uncomfortable? I would not do that now. Actually, I would actually have maybe a different response. But I think we just need to be aware of who we're talking about, how many people are in the room versus those, and try and find a way, like we would with our families and friends. You know, when they're going through something, just listen to them, like talk to them in that way, find out about their experiences. We don't invalidate it, do we? So why would we in a professional sense? So yeah, just a few thoughts around that. Great,
thank you. I'm aware we've got lots of questions and we're not going to be able to get through them all in the next 7 minutes. So just to say, what we are going to try and do is we are going to try and sort of collate some of these and kind of feedback, sort of answers to common questions in any follow-up kind of email. So please don't be disheartened if we haven't got to your question. I think there's one which actually I think is quite, well, probably quite relevant for a lot of people on this webinar, which is that, you know, a lot of people are quite new to equality, diversity and inclusion. And I suppose it's what advice, if people want to kind of learn about this kind of area of work, where would you suggest they go? Where's a good kind of starting point? Obviously we have your Parry, we have your training coming up with NCVO, so I would say that, but do you have any other suggestions, maybe in terms of good places to start in terms of reading, training, etc.?
Yeah, I think there's so much now that's available out there, which I think is a wonderful thing, but can also be a bit overwhelming. I think, again, it's going back to what is it that we as a charity are here to do, and what are the gaps that I have in my knowledge right now around that. And so I'm thinking of some of the charities I work with. They've recognised that perhaps their understanding around racial justice has been really low, and so they've gone out and they've done some research watch some videos. A lot of it felt very America focused. So people are now saying, actually, if we read Reniero Lodge's book, that's so UK focused and is brilliant. And then Akala's book, Natives, again, both of those just really fantastic UK based books that really unpack how these are systems of power and oppression. They are both about racial injustice and give some ideas and suggestions around how anti-racism can be created. But actually you can extrapolate a lot of the learning in those to other forms of oppression as well. So I think they're really good foundational knowledge. I don't know whether this is a cheeky tip to my own website, but on our website, we do have a page of resources that's just our favorite current resources that we're referring people to. I think we've got a video on there about trans allyship, looking at disability justice. And the reality is there's so much out there now that I think there's no reason that people can't go out, listen to some podcasts while you go for a walk or a run, read a book if that's your thing, or even just watch some videos. I think there's also, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I think thinking about the TV that you watch and the books you read, the fiction that you read, all of that stuff shifts your perspective on the world. If we continue to watch the same television programs starring the same people, written by the same people, the same books written and starring and centering the stories of certain groups of people, I think we end up not seeing that actually this is a much more diverse world out there. And it stops us going, if we can broaden it out, it stops us going into that single story narrative for any particular marginalized community. So I think do the more basic research out there and do the reading in those great texts, but also just immerse yourself in the media that's out there that you can just enjoy. And I think that kind of learning is really wonderful. I can put links in, I'm sure, into the chat, or we could send it out to those books if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We can definitely send some of that out in our follow-up email. I think there's one question which I've kind of pulled together a few kind of questions about, which is, I think there's quite a lot of concern about the sort of challenges of recruiting kind of non-white middle-class professional individuals onto trustee boards. So I guess maybe a sort of final question for all three of you in terms of sort of any top tips for reaching a kind of more diverse audience in terms of your kind of trustee recruitment process. Yeah, and particularly, I think there was particular concern when people are sort of based in very white middle class areas, that can be kind of particularly difficult. Sophie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, you know, getting your advert out far and wide and making it really explicit of what you're looking for is really important. So there's lots of platforms that you can use. I should plug Trustees Unlimited, given I used to run it, and Reach, of course. There's the Young Trustees movement. We haven't actually talked about youth diversity on boards, but that's also really important. Organisations like the amazing Girl Dreamer, who also share things with their community. So think creatively about that. But then I also think the way in which you recruit is important. So Alan talked about us welcoming in videos and things like that. So making it engaging. We offered phone conversations with people who are interested, which was a massive commitment. Olivia and I did an awful lot of conversations with people who are interested. And actually it was a sort of weeding people out who were the usual suspects, who actually, when we had a phone call with them, we could, in the nicest possible way, make it clear that we weren't looking for more of the same and that maybe they could engage in different ways, which has been helpful in itself. I know it's difficult, but I also think you have to go and do some proactive conversations in communities, headhunting, you know, get really creative about this. It's and also think about what you're inviting people to. Are you inviting them to what looks like quite a staid meeting, or are you prepared to say, actually, we want your input to help shape things up and make this more engaging? So you're not coming to fit into the way we do things. We want you to be part of creating something different alongside us.
Great, thank you. Alan, Parry, anything else to add? Go for it.
Oh,
Go for it,
ahead,
Barry.
Alan.
Sorry.
Okay. I mean, I think for me, I agree with all of what Sophie's just said. I think the only bits I'd add is that there's perhaps something to be done about looking at where the problem is in your data as well. So hopefully people are gathering recruitment data for staff and trustees. And it can be really useful to say, well, do we see this drop off? Is it at advert? Are we underrepresented in the diversity at advert stage, or is it at application? Is it at interview stage? Is it at appointment stage? Because actually in each of those points, it's then worth thinking about, so what do we need to change about our process to remove some barriers? I think the number one thing everyone thinks about is, where do we advertise? I think that's not always the number one thing. I think there are other things to consider, such as the role design itself. And Little Village spent so much time thinking about, how do we design a trustee role that is inclusive, that is appealing to people with lived experience, not just those with professional experience, and what will make them feel as if this role is a meaningful role for them to actually apply for. So I think for me, there's something really basic around that role design bit. And I think Home Truths talks about that, the Akivo report, quite clearly.
Great, thank you. And we will send out links to kind of all those things and the kind of additional resources that Barry's mentioned in our follow-up emails. Alan, I'm going to give you a very, very short amount of time to say any final few words on that, or are you're okay?
No, I think it's been covered. But yeah, I think you have to take yourself out of the traditional methods of recruiting. Like, look at the language in your job descriptions. Do certain words need to be there? Do desirables need to be there? Like, that still places a hierarchy. Either you need it or you don't, right? Look at where you're recruiting, all that other stuff. But yes, been covered by my great colleagues. So
great. Cool. Well, it's 2 minutes past 12, so sorry for running 2 minutes over. But before we finish up, I just want to say a big, big thank you to Sophie, Barry, and Alan for, I think, a really, really insightful session. And thank you all very much for coming and listening to us. And we do hope to see you all at our future Trustee Week sessions. Thanks all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.